My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because the rain that touched the earth today carried more than water. Something was waiting inside its fragrance, something your soulmate was not prepared to remember. What you are about to hear was meant to find you before that memory finishes changing the direction of their heart. Do not rush past these words. Heaven has been watching a quiet awakening unfold, and it began the instant your soulmate stood near a window, breathed in the rain, and suddenly realized that it smelled exactly like the day you first met. They were not searching for you when it happened. They were moving through an ordinary moment, carrying thoughts they had carried many times before, pretending that everything inside them had settled. Then the first drop struck the warm ground. The air changed. That unmistakable scent rose from the pavement, the soil, the trees, and the silent spaces between buildings. Your soulmate stopped. Their surroundings remained the same, yet time seemed to fold around them. One breath pulled them backward, and in an instant, they were standing in the past with you again. At first, they could not understand why their heart had begun beating differently. They looked around as if someone had called their name. No one had. The street was nearly empty, and the rain was growing steadier. Yet something within them whispered, "You have felt this before." Then your face appeared in their memory, not as a distant image, but with startling clarity. They remembered the light in your eyes. They remembered the way you tried to hide your nervousness. They remembered one small movement you made that day, a movement you believed nobody had noticed. But they noticed it, beloved. They noticed far more than they ever admitted. That is the first truth being revealed. Your soulmate did not remember merely meeting you. They remembered recognizing you. There is a difference. A meeting can pass through the mind and disappear, but recognition settles somewhere deeper. When they first looked at you, something inside them became quiet. They may not have possessed the spiritual language to explain it. They may have called it curiosity, attraction, coincidence, or an unusual feeling. But heaven saw the truth. Their spirit paused because your presence felt strangely familiar. Stay with this message, because the part they remembered next is the part they have spent a long time trying to bury. On that first day, rain had begun unexpectedly. Neither of you had planned for it. People hurried past, seeking shelter and protecting whatever they carried. But for a few suspended moments, the world around you seemed to move while the two of you remained held inside an invisible stillness. Your soulmate remembers a drop of rain resting near your eyebrow. They remember the way you smiled, not because anything particularly funny had happened, but because you were attempting to make the awkwardness feel lighter. That smile has followed them through more nights than you know. They remembered your voice next. Not every sentence, not every word, but the feeling your voice placed inside them. There was warmth in it, mixed with restraint. You were open, yet cautious. You were present, yet part of you seemed ready to retreat before anyone could misunderstand your heart. Your soulmate sensed this. Even then, they understood that you were not someone who offered trust carelessly. They realized that whatever softness you showed them had been precious. The tragedy is that they understood its value most clearly only after distance entered the story. The rain revealed this to them without warning. They closed their eyes, believing the memory would fade if they refused to follow it. Instead, it became stronger. They heard the distant sound of traffic as it had sounded that day. They remembered the color of the sky and the coolness gathering in the air. They remembered standing closer to you than strangers usually stand, yet feeling no desire to move away. And then came a detail that unsettled them. They remembered the exact moment you looked down because your eyes had almost revealed too much. You believed you hid that moment well. You did not. Your soulmate saw the change in your expression. They saw tenderness rise and then disappear behind composure. At the time, they told themselves they had imagined it. They were afraid to believe that someone like you might feel something real so quickly. Now, as rain surrounded them again, they finally accepted what their heart had known. Something mutual began that day, before either of you had the courage to name it. But this was only the doorway. The rain had not returned merely to remind them of the beginning. It had returned to expose what happened afterward. Your soulmate began remembering all the moments when they almost reached for you and stopped. They remembered messages written and erased. They remembered conversations rehearsed in private but never spoken. They remembered moments when your name appeared on their screen and they waited too long to respond, not because you were unimportant, but because your importance frightened them. Every delay seemed small at the time. Together, those delays became a wall, and that wall eventually made you wonder whether the connection had existed only in your imagination. It did not exist only in your imagination. Heaven witnessed every hidden reaction. When you entered a room, their awareness shifted before they consciously saw you. When someone mentioned a place connected to you, their attention sharpened. When a song carried the emotional tone of your connection, they listened differently. They tried to move through life as though you were merely one chapter among many, but your presence had become the quiet sentence underneath every page. They could avoid saying your name, yet they could not stop measuring other connections against the feeling of being understood by you. And none of them felt the same. Do not look away now, because the next revelation is the one that made them step out into the rain instead of remaining beneath shelter. Your soulmate realized they had been remembering the day incorrectly for a long time. They had told themselves that you appeared during an uncertain period, that circumstances were inconvenient, and that the timing was wrong. These explanations protected them from responsibility. But while the rain touched their face, a different understanding emerged. You did not arrive at the wrong time. You arrived at the exact moment when they were being offered a chance to become honest. They were simply not ready to accept the invitation. You were not sent into their path to rescue them from every difficulty. You were not responsible for repairing wounds they had refused to face. But your presence illuminated those wounds. Your patience showed them how impatient they had become with themselves. Your sincerity exposed how frequently they hid behind half-truths. Your courage revealed every place where fear had been making their decisions. Loving you, even silently, required them to see who they were. That was why they pulled away when the connection began to deepen. They did not withdraw because your light was insufficient. They withdrew because it was clear. This distinction matters, beloved, because you have spent too much time asking what you lacked. You examined your appearance, your words, your timing, your tenderness, and even the moments when you remained silent. You wondered whether being more distant would have made them chase you or whether being more expressive would have made them stay. But heaven is asking you to release that question. You could not have performed your way into the readiness they had not yet developed. The rain is teaching them that now. As they walked, water gathering on their clothes and running through their hair, another scene rose within them. It was a moment after your first meeting, one you may barely remember. You said something simple, perhaps a gentle observation, perhaps a quiet wish for their happiness, perhaps a sentence about believing that people could begin again. You did not know that your words touched a private place in them. They carried that sentence home. They repeated it while lying awake. And much later, when life felt empty, those same words returned like a light beneath a closed door. They never told you. That unspoken truth became the second major revelation of the rain. Your soulmate has kept a private collection of things connected to you. Not necessarily objects that anyone else would recognize. Their collection is made of details, a phrase you used, a color you wore, the expression on your face when you were trying not to laugh, the way your voice changed when you spoke about something meaningful. They remember what made you uncomfortable. They remember what brought you alive. They remember a dream you mentioned casually, although you assumed they had forgotten it minutes later. They did not forget. The reason they pretended not to remember was that memory made their feelings undeniable. If they admitted how clearly they remembered you, they would also have to admit how deeply you mattered. So they adopted a quieter defense. They acted uncertain. They told themselves they needed more time, more proof, a clearer sign. Yet no proof could satisfy a heart committed to hiding. Every sign was explained away, and every opening was postponed until the opportunity seemed to disappear. But heaven does not measure an opportunity only by what is visible. While you believed the story had gone silent, work was occurring beneath the silence. You were learning not to abandon yourself for an answer. You were discovering that devotion without boundaries becomes exhaustion. You were being taught to protect your tenderness without turning it into bitterness. And your soulmate was being brought face to face with the consequences of emotional avoidance. Every path they chose to distract themselves eventually curved back toward the same question: why did I feel most like myself around the person I was most afraid to love honestly? Today, the rain gave them the answer. They felt like themselves around you because you did not fall in love with their performance. You responded to the person beneath it. You sensed when their smile carried weight. You recognized when humor was being used as a shield. You noticed the pauses in their voice. You did not always confront them, but your presence quietly said, "You do not have to pretend here." For someone who had survived by controlling how others perceived them, that safety felt beautiful, and terrifying. This is where the memory changed from nostalgia into revelation. Your soulmate suddenly remembered the way you looked at the rain on the day you met. While everyone else complained about the inconvenience, you seemed to listen to it. Perhaps you placed your hand outside the shelter. Perhaps you watched the drops gather against glass. Perhaps your face softened as though the weather had unlocked a private world within you. They did not understand why that image stayed with them. Now they do. You were showing them, without words, that interruption can become invitation. The rain interrupted your plans that day, but it created space for your paths to cross. The distance later interrupted the connection, but it created space for truths neither of you could learn while clinging to an immediate outcome. And now the rain has interrupted your soulmate's denial. They stood beneath the open sky and realized that the scent was not merely similar. It was exact. The same warmth had risen from the ground. The same cool wind had moved through the air. Even the rhythm of the drops seemed familiar. They felt as though the earth itself had preserved the memory and released it at the appointed moment. Whether anyone else would call it coincidence no longer mattered to them. Their heart received it as a summons. Then something extraordinary happened within their memory. They recalled what took place seconds before they first saw you. This is a detail they had almost completely lost. On that day, before your paths crossed, your soulmate had been thinking about leaving. Not merely leaving the location, but abandoning hope in a larger sense. They had grown weary of temporary connections and confusing promises. Silently, they had decided to become unreachable. They thought distance would protect them. They thought lowering their expectations would spare them disappointment. Then the rain began, their plans changed, and you appeared. You arrived immediately after they had chosen to close their heart. That is why your presence affected them so powerfully. You were the contradiction to a decision nobody else knew they had made. They had told themselves sincerity was rare, and then they heard sincerity in your voice. They had decided connection required too much effort, and then conversation with you felt unexpectedly natural. They had promised themselves that no one would be allowed close enough to unsettle them, and then one look from you reached a place their defenses had guarded for years. Yet instead of accepting the gift, they became suspicious of it. They wondered whether something so meaningful could remain. They feared that if they trusted the connection, it would eventually be taken away. So they began leaving emotionally before you could leave physically. They created confusion where clarity had once been possible. They offered warmth and then withdrew it. They moved closer, then disappeared behind silence. You felt the change, but because you did not know their hidden fear, you interpreted their distance as a judgment of your worth. That interpretation wounded you more deeply than they understood. Heaven saw the nights when you replayed conversations, searching for the place where everything changed. You remembered your own words with painful precision. You wondered whether you had been too vulnerable, too quiet, too hopeful, or simply too much. But the shift did not occur because you made one wrong move. It occurred because the reality of the bond had crossed the boundary your soulmate had built around their heart. The closer you came to being real, the more their old fear demanded escape. They are beginning to see this pattern. That is the third great revelation carried by the rain. Your soulmate has realized they were not protecting themselves from you. They were protecting an old wound from being healed, because healing would require them to stop identifying with it. They had worn disappointment like armor for so long that freedom felt unfamiliar. Your love did not threaten their peace, it threatened the story that told them peace was impossible. When this realization reached them, they whispered something aloud. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the rain, but heaven heard them. They said, "Should have stayed." Notice what they did not say. They did not say, "I should have won." They did not say, "I should have controlled the outcome." They said they should have stayed. In that moment, they understood that presence was the gift you had asked from them. You were not demanding perfection. You were not asking them to possess every answer. You only needed them to remain honest when uncertainty appeared. But they mistook uncertainty for a warning to run. Now every drop seemed to return an unanswered question. What if they had stayed during the difficult conversation? What if they had explained their silence? What if they had told you that your closeness frightened them because it mattered? What if they had admitted that the thought of losing you caused the very behavior that pushed you away? These questions did not arrive to torment them. They arrived to awaken responsibility. Regret can become a prison, but honest regret can also become a doorway. Your soulmate is standing before that doorway now. Do not mistake this message as an instruction to stop your life and wait beside the past. Heaven has not asked you to shrink your future while another person learns courage. You have been called to continue becoming whole, to keep honoring your gifts, and to remain available to joy. The awakening happening inside your soulmate belongs to them. The choice that follows must also belong to them. Love becomes sacred when it is freely chosen, not when one heart carries both sides of the bridge. Still, something is shifting, and you have felt it. Perhaps you have experienced sudden memories without knowing why. Perhaps you have dreamed of rain, doors, familiar streets, or conversations that ended before the most important sentence was spoken. Perhaps a calmness has begun replacing the urgency you once felt. You may believe that calmness means the connection is fading, but sometimes peace arrives when the soul stops chasing what truth has already set into motion. You are not being prepared to repeat the old pattern. You are being prepared to recognize whether something genuinely new is emerging. That distinction will become important soon. As your soulmate continued walking, they reached a place that reminded them of you. It was not necessarily where you first met, yet something about it echoed that day: the angle of a doorway, the glow from a window, the sound of water running along the road. They stopped again. This time, the memory did not show them your face. It showed them themselves as they had been beside you. They saw a version of themselves that was softer, more hopeful, and more honest than the person they had become afterward. This realization shook them more than missing you. They understood that losing closeness with you had also meant losing contact with a part of themselves. You had not created that part, it had always existed. But your presence had made it feel safe enough to emerge. Around you, they imagined a life that did not require constant emotional defense. They imagined laughter without calculation, affection without strategy, and silence that did not need to be filled. When they withdrew from you, they returned to familiar survival. And called it stability. Today they recognized the difference. Familiarity is not always peace. Sometimes it is simply a pattern whose pain has become predictable. Your soulmate saw that many of their choices after you were attempts to recreate the comfort you gave them without facing the vulnerability your connection required. They searched for easier conversations, less revealing bonds, and situations where they could remain partially hidden. But ease without truth eventually became emptiness. No matter how pleasant the surface appeared, some essential depth was missing. They were seeking your affect while avoiding your significance. The rain exposed that contradiction. It reminded them that what they missed was not merely attention. They missed being seen. They missed the way you listened beneath their sentences. They missed the gentleness that existed between you before fear complicated everything. They missed the possibility of becoming better. Not to earn love, but because love had awakened something worthy within them. And then came another twist heaven had kept hidden until this moment. Your soulmate remembered that on the day you first met, they had nearly taken a different route. One small decision placed them where you would be. A delay, a forgotten item, an unexpected change, or a sudden instinct redirected them. At the time it seemed insignificant. Today, they traced the chain of events and realized how easily your paths might never have crossed. That realization made your meeting feel even more sacred. But there was more. You, too, had almost not been there.